Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington. Well, it's been about a year and a half since the Gulf oil spill, and I guess everything's under control. The drilling has now become more regulated. The recovery is taking place. Well, I guess that's what we're supposed to think anyway, because there isn't a heck of a lot of coverage of what's really happening. Now joining us to tell us what her research has shown her is Antonia Juhasz. Antonia is the author of the book Black Tide, The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill. Thanks for joining us, Antonia. And Antonia is joining us from San Francisco.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with on the drilling side. So I think most of us figure, okay, they stopped the deep water drilling and they're not going to let it start again until everything's more regulated and more inspected. So what's the reality?
Well, the reality is that there was a short-term moratorium that was put in place right after the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig that lasted for a couple months, and it was on new drilling, that's all. Production continued, so that means the production of oil continued in the Gulf of Mexico, but new drilling for new wells was stopped. That did very little to impact operations in the Gulf, and it did very little to impact oil. In fact, in the United States, we're producing more oil today than we were at this time a year ago. Essentially, business went on pretty much as usual. Even what was supposed to be a 6-month-long moratorium on that new drilling didn't even last for the full amount of time, and things pretty much got underway even before the investigations were anywhere close to being over.
And that includes continued drilling by BP.
Oh yes, BP is the largest producer of both oil and natural gas in the United States broadly, but also in the Gulf of Mexico. It continued those operations and continues to this day, even though we now finally do have the results a year and a half later of some very important investigations into the disaster, and those investigations are damning not only for BP but for the entire oil industry, which should make us not only worried about the ongoing drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, but offshore drilling everywhere around the world.
And so what were the results of that report, and how does that impact ongoing drilling as it goes on now?
There have been many key investigations, but the one most recently concluded was by the Marine Safety Board, and that was a joint investigation by the Coast Guard and the Interior Department, which jointly regulate offshore drilling in the United States. And they found a host of serious failures on behalf of BP, but also on behalf of Transocean, which is the largest owner and operator of offshore drilling rigs in the world. Transocean was the owner and operator of the Deepwater Horizon. Of the 126 people on the rig that day, 79 worked for Transocean. So the fact that there were operational problems all across Transocean's operations is problematic for drilling everywhere, but also Halliburton, the largest energy services company in the world, also one of the largest operators in offshore drilling. Halliburton's cement job was found severely lacking. Also, just simply the blowout preventer itself, this key piece of machinery that sits between the ocean floor and the rig, it's key to every single offshore operation in the world. One of the sort of least noted findings of this 500-page report was concerned that simply the pressure of the pipeline, the 5 miles of pipeline that carry from the rig to the floor, was too much pressure for the blowout preventer. That means that any offshore rig operating in 5,000 feet of water or more, which is many offshore rigs around the world, could be at risk simply because basically that's just too deep. Our technology can't sustain those operations. And what I found in my interviews with oil workers, people who live on the Gulf, people whose family members died in the Deepwater Horizon, people who've been working in this industry for decades, is that that's basically the bottom line of many experts, is that offshore drilling has moved too fast, too far. The oil industry is obviously keen to get out there because there's a lot of oil in offshore, but their technology hasn't kept up with their desire.
What's happened in terms of the regulatory regime? if in fact a lot of these things that happened in the BP disaster are systemic, are they now going and looking at all the other deep water drills in the Gulf, and what's to stop all this from happening again?
There's nothing really that's been put in place to stop this from happening again. And again, this isn't just a problem in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. This is a global problem. Part of the problem is, of course, a very, very weak regulatory regime, a regulatory regime with which the government is very much in bed with the industry and vice versa. But in the United States, we actually have some of the better regulations in offshore drilling than in other places in the world, and our regulations didn't come close to protecting us from this disaster. We've seen regulatory changes on the edges, regulatory changes that are better because it's the Obama administration, frankly, than they would have been if it was the Bush administration. But the infrastructure that's in place in the United States is one that's been put in place by years of oil governments, and even the Obama administration didn't have the wherewithal or really the desire to stand up very aggressively against the oil industry and make any systemic changes. And basically, sadly, business has continued largely as usual. And what that means is it's been a year and a half since this disaster. There's still mile-long plates of oil that are floating around in the ocean that were released in the Gulf oil disaster. These are washed up regularly as massive oil tar balls that soak beaches and soak wildlife and soak marshland and continue to have a devastating impact on the Gulf of Mexico because we have hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. So this oil is still sitting there. It's on the bottom of the ocean floor. It's floating around in mass in the ocean, and it's floating up, and it's a year and a half after the spill.
Now the oil industry says there are hundreds, I guess maybe more, and I guess it's maybe thousands, of deep water oil rigs around the world, and we've had one bad disaster, but mostly it's safe, and you can see that because you're not seeing these kinds of spills all the time.
There are thousands of offshore operations around the world, not deep offshore operations. Moving into the deep water, which how you measure it varies with who you're talking to, but it's usually considered at 1,000 feet and deeper is new. It's been happening really just within the last 20 years, and then moving out even deeper into this 5,000 feet, 7,000 feet, even deeper. One of BP's operations in the Gulf of Mexico is farther down than Mount Everest is up. This is new. This is new technology, it's new operations. The workers who are doing the work haven't been trained to do it appropriately. The companies aren't investing as they should. And that's because their return is so big, even if they don't put the best operations out there, because there is so much oil and there is so little regulatory oversight. And we have seen constant accidents that happen not only in the deep water but also in shallow water with massive oil spills that happen regularly. This one got so much attention because it's the largest in the world. It's 5 million barrels of oil were spilled. We don't see that all the time, thank goodness, but that's why it's the largest, and it's the one that should get our attention.
Now, people are experts that are critics of all of deep water drilling. What would they like to see? Is it more regulation? Do they want a real moratorium on deep water drilling? What are people calling for?
Well, I'm calling for a full moratorium on deep water drilling. I don't think we should do it at all. In the United States, we actually have moratoriums on offshore drilling. In the state of California, for example, there hasn't been any new offshore drilling since the 80s because we have a moratorium. Off the East Coast, there's a full moratorium again on offshore drilling. And this has been a constant debate with the oil industry. The only places they're allowed to drill in the United States is certain parts of Alaska and in the Gulf of Mexico. The reason why they were allowed to continue in the Gulf of Mexico is because the legislators there were so bought and sold by the oil industry. In the rest of the country, we have moratoriums, and we have it because we've had major oil disasters, and that's what we need throughout the country, to maintain throughout the country, and I think throughout the world. The costs are simply too great for the offsetted benefits of this type of production. We simply don't know how to do it. The environmental costs are too high when we make mistakes, and even when operations are operating as they should, They contribute to climate change, mass pollution, harm to wildlife and sea life, tourism, the fishing industry. These are other industries that could make lots of money and could support people and jobs instead of being harmed by accidents caused by the oil industry.
Thanks for joining us. Antonia, again, is the author of the book Black Tide, The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.